I'm Brad Sparks, the U.S. Chapter Director for A4S, and really excited to share and introduce the next topic today, which is focusing on the S of the ESG framework. So looking particularly at social and human capital. The pandemic has put a spotlight on this topic when we think about mental health, job creation, and in particular, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've heard a lot so far today about achieving a just transition, and this session is really going to deep dive into how the finance community is central to driving and creating positive social impact. To help get us started, let's begin with the recent conversation I had with the Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of Levi Strauss & Company, Harmeet Singh, discussing social and human capital. Let's have a look. All right, Harmeet, thank you so much for joining us at this year's A4S Summit to talk a little bit about social and human capital. I know an issue that's very critical and important to Levi Strauss & Company. So to help get us going, in a recent interview you did with Bloomberg, I noticed one of the things you talked about how a CFO is critical to connecting the dots. And when we think again about value creation in the context of human and social capital, there are lots of dots to connect, one of those being diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I was hoping you could start us off by sharing a little bit about your own perspective, why diversity, equity, and inclusion is so vital for companies today, and what it means to you at Levi Strauss.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Brad. Let me start by saying that Levi Strauss himself was an immigrant and, came to America, centuries ago and helped establish the company. Building a diverse, set of employee base as well as, business that's driven by sustainability as its core foundation was important to him and to the creators of the company. It's we in the company live by a principle of driving profit through principle, which is not only important what we make, but is also important how we make it. And so diversity, equity, inclusion is a key priority for us. It's important that our employee base reflects the demographics and the profile of our consumer base, not only in the US, but geographically around the world. And so, last year in the middle of the pandemic, when unfortunately we all saw what happened with George Floyd, we took a look in the mirror and said, okay, what are our diversity statistics in the company? We realized that at leadership levels in the US, we had an opportunity. So we're very transparent about our opportunity, and we made commitments about what we need to do as a company, and we are actually executing against those commitments. For example, we didn't have a Black member on our board. We added an outstanding leader to our board as an example. We also like to put our money where our mouth is, and the CFO can make a real difference there. And for example, when we rolled out our long-term incentive program for 21, we have incorporated, diversity statistics on a 3-year basis, as well as the desire to improve the culture in the organization. And so we're going to measure that, and we're going to ensure people are incented towards doing the right thing. So again, as I say, it's important to connect the dots. As a CFO can help connect the dots, but it's important to connect the foundation of the company, the priorities the company is advocating, and the results that are driven as a result of everything else that's happening. And having a diverse employee base and having employee base that's critical to growing the company is something that's important to us, and that's why DE&I is a core priority for the company.
Right. Well, thank you for that framing. And when you talk about opportunity, as you did, and again, you're focusing now on the influential role that a CFO has. Are there some additional examples that you can share, maybe of specific actions that you've taken as CFO to help drive a diverse culture?
Sure. A couple of things. I firmly believe a CFO can do two things. One, help set the right tone at the top. And second, beside helping develop strategy, build the roadmap to unlock the strategy, and deliver results, a CFO can also ensure that we measure and communicate the value that's been created for all our stakeholders. So a couple of things that we have done over the last 12 months. We have introduced paid sick leave for our hourly associates. We have a lot of stores around the world, and in the US, this was important, especially during the pandemic where health was critical. So we introduced that. We have introduced paid family leave. We are a big advocate of it. I remember looking at the earlier numbers, which said that 10% of our workforce would at some stage be on leave, and it would be a cost to us because we'd have to help continue the work by replacing them with contractors. But at the end of the day, the actual cost is has been a lot less, and it's built the morale, and it helps to motivate people. We about a decade ago introduced a workers' well-being program, largely focused on women employed by our manufacturing vendors around the world. And it was all about driving financial and health literacy. And we saw that pay back in terms of higher productivity through lower absenteeism, as well as stability in the workforce. And I think the ratio is 4-to-1. Personally, after we focused on D&I and reintroduced that as a key priority about a year ago, in my group, I introduced a mentor-mentee program where, along with me, my direct reports all took on a mentee, and a mentee was a diverse candidate, and that has really been a home run. In fact, demand is higher than supply, and is going on well, etc. So I think there are lots of examples where we have actually taken this on and are rolling this forward. And I think the CFO can be very instrumental in making things happen in an organization.
Yeah, great. Those are some great examples, and it's terrific to hear that specific actions you've taken. I guess as you've done this, is there any advice you would have for others as they think about what they can do?
Yeah, no, I'd say personalize it. Be passionate about it. Believe in it. Take a long-term view, because you probably like, the entire sustainability actions that organizations take. In the short term, you probably have to invest. And on E&I, for example, our investment is we've hired, a leader that we brought from the outside, and she's building her team. And so it requires investment in the short term, but it does pay back over time. I'm a big advocate of paid family leave. I know it's something that is near and dear to our hearts. We believe that's something organizations should embrace. It's also important to be authentic and display empathy. These days, most of our employees working from home or in a hybrid environment under the pandemic are, there's a lot of stress. So we have to listen and embrace it. But more importantly, some examples about taking this personally. We have different enterprise resource groups, and I am the chair of the Asian enterprise resource group. So when in the US, some time ago, there was this, a lot of Asian hate that was surfacing. I wrote a op-ed on it and talked to them about my own personal experiences and what the ERG was doing. There are communities that sometimes feel, especially minorities, that sometimes feel there is this artificial glass ceiling in organizations. Something that I have not faced, but I sponsored a fireside on breaking the bamboo ceiling with June Hyun, who is actually talked about this, and we invited the entire organization to come and understand or just get a sense of our own experiences and how we have tackled things that stood in our way, and I think that was also well accepted. So I think the things all of us can do that can personalize and ensure we are leading from the front.
Great, yeah, great advice. So leading from the front. I guess my other question for you, Harmeet, is when we think about social and human capital, if we look maybe beyond diversity, equity, inclusion to some of the other dimensions of social and human capital, what do you see as being most critical to address on those other dimensions, and what are some key takeaways you can share with the audience in terms of how to respond to those areas?
Yeah, no, I think employees are an engine of growth, and I'll talk about what we're doing on sustainability. That's important. One thing that's worked for me, because I spent half my life overseas and half my life in the US, was building teams that were complementary to my own skill sets, building a team that, from a gender balance, represented, both men and women, and ensuring that at times there's some groups that need to be called on to express an opinion, and making sure one is sensitive to that. So I think the various ways to diversify your talent base to ensure that diversity is broader than just culture or race. It's about diversity of experience. It's about ensuring that we bring in skills that are critical and we upskill people. Our organization, which is, like most organizations, trying to automate or digitize, not everybody is comfortable with it. Some people are apprehensive about automating, and believe that their work goes away. So what we have done is we have had now 2 boot camps where we have upskilled people on machine learning and AI. When I introduced or explored the optionality of introducing robotics, the first reaction from people was, "Oh, my job is going to go away." And I said, "No, in fact, we will ensure that your job gets better, because robotic technology will automate the transactional activities." And today we have about 30 different forms of robotic technology in the organization. We have saved, I think, about 6,000 to 8,000 hours. So, those hours can be redeployed if people are upskilled to better activities and the transaction work gets away. And it's a service now we have offered to the entire organization. So, RPA as a service is something that, I believe in, and I think that only will drive higher productivity and move people to better jobs within the organization. So I think upskilling is another initiative that we can take.
I think I'll wrap up our time today, Harmeet, but really appreciate you taking some time to speak with us today at this year's A4S Summit. Thank you.
Thanks, Brad. And I hope everybody has a wonderful summit. And this is a summit that I look forward to every year. So thank you.
Hello, everyone. That was inspiring work from Harmeet and the team at Levi Strauss & Company. I'm glad we were able to listen to that. I also want to welcome everyone to our session. My name is Devinder Valeri, and I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian chapter of the A4S CFO Leadership Network. I'm also the Director of Strategy, Risk, and Performance at CPA Canada. The pandemic has highlighted the interconnectedness between people, planet, and profit. Particularly, it has put an emphasis on the S in ESG with an importance of social and human capital, including mental health, job creation, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've heard so far today about setting a path to a sustainable future and achieving a just transition. We heard from Harmeet and his work at Levi's. This session is going to continue in that conversation. We're going to explore how the finance community is central to creating positive social impact. I'm pleased to be here today with a fantastic lineup of guests, and I want to introduce them to you as well. I want to make sure we've got them. Yes, I have with me joining today Patrice Impey. Patrice is the Chief Financial Officer and General Manager of Finance, Risk, and Supply Chain Management for the City of Vancouver. I also have with me George Davies. He is the Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer for Intel Corporation. I want to welcome both of you to the session, and recognizing we're live and recognizing, digital elements of trying to get connected. It's difficult, but I'm glad you're both here. So welcome to the session.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon to everybody.
Well, let's get going. And I know we've lost some time, but George, perhaps I'll start with you. How does Intel's approach compare to some of the points that we heard from Harmeet? What social and human capital issues are you grappling with?
We're 110,000 employees worldwide, plus almost an equal number of contractors. So almost any issue you can imagine, whether it be social justice or other dynamics, are playing out in the communities in which we operate, and are very important to our employees, and they're very interested in how the company is going to respond, and they have high expectations for us on these issues. It probably was most dramatically started with the social justice issues, which seemed a long time ago in terms of the eruption of activity in that area and the ongoing activities, but also just all the implications of COVID, and all the implications of our engagements in various countries. So we expect and we hold ourselves to a high standard as we engage with our employees on these issues. And also employee safety in COVID. You can't underestimate the importance of that. That has been a primary concern. The world has been very dependent on semiconductor availability, and that depends on whether people can safely go into our foundries and factories and operate. And so we have had tremendous engagement with our employees and also with our communities on operating safely, as many locations were locking down facilities, and yet they knew our facilities needed to operate, but we had to have really almost perfect standards for how people were protected over this past year, and just over the past 2 years. And it's just now it's just part of the way of doing business. And rest of our employees are still working from home. And so, of course, all the issues that come with isolation everybody talks about the great resignation going on, and a lot of that is just the disconnect that employees feel from the traditional ways of working. And we all have to do better at thinking through solutions. One of the points that I made when the pandemic first started, and having read Black Swan, which is a great book for kind of tuning your mind, is that you cannot predict the downstream impacts of this. And every 6 months, people make pronouncements about what they're going to do and how it's going to work, and it's been wrong every single time. And so, staying nimble, doing the things that protect your people first, and then thinking about what the future looks like as flexibly as possible. I'm sure these are things that I know all of my peers are facing, and I'm sure in managing a city, it's got to be very similar.
Thank you for that. And that's a good segue for Patrice as well. Patrice, as the CFO for the city, thinking about social and human capital might also be at the heart of your strategy and decision making. So perhaps also for yourself, what are some, areas or issues that you're also focusing on?
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks, Devinder, and thanks for having me here. Yes, certainly, cities are social and human capital is a big part of cities. The mission for the city of Vancouver is that we build a great city of communities that cares about our people, our environment, and the opportunity to live, work, and prosper. So, people is clearly the center of that. And nowadays, most people around the world live in cities. So, we expect a lot of our cities now. It's part of sort of what makes our life interesting, our communities, and we expect them to be, resilient and address all of the issues that come about. So I would say that's changed actually over the years. I think cities traditionally were, to provide utilities, safe drinking water and the roads, and pick up the garbage and those kind of things. And I would say on the social side, it was probably, you had your police services and your fire and safety services, and that was kind of it. And we've definitely seen, quite a shift over the years to much more involvement in the social side, and residents and businesses expecting the cities to take on a bigger role on that side of things. So we've really seen that shift, and certainly we see ourselves as, when you talk the government of the city, the role is really not just about physical infrastructure, it is about social infrastructure and about community and making it, a great place to live for all of the community. But the city council that we have now, for their term, they identified 4 key priorities, in addition to the regular work that cities do. And one is accelerating or addressing affordability and housing. So Vancouver's been sort of a center point for many years of expensive housing, and so that sort of is high on the list. Definitely, there's a social, human aspect to that. Building a resilient local economy, and now rebuilding post-pandemic, and the impact that has on so much of our local population with our local businesses. Accelerating action on climate change. And then the fourth one is increasing our focus on equity and social issues. And that one, I think, really speaks to sort of the changes that have happened over the last years, and certainly exacerbated through the pandemic, and really understood much more, related to equity, racism, homelessness, reconciliation with our Indigenous communities. And when we went through the pandemic, very clearly, we had to reach out to all those people who didn't have a home, who couldn't self-isolate, who couldn't, when restaurants closed, how did they, they didn't have kitchens and places to cook. So there's a huge amount of work that the city had to take on. And so really recognizing that shift in what's expected of cities. So so we've got that set up in these 4 priorities, which is, as I say, historically a bit of a shift for a city, with so much of it focused on the social and human side.
Excellent. George, one of the big challenges for a technology sector, I guess, is gender diversity. Are you able to say more about how you are closing this gender gap? And why is it relevant to finance? And what can finance do to support this change? And lastly, How are you tackling diversity, equity, and inclusion more broadly?
Great question. We have for many years had a program of looking at the factors that we want to see improvement in our company early on. Conflict minerals and making sure you weren't contributing to the abuse of workers somewhere else in the world just to get your materials. But early on, we saw at Intel that there was, just a significant problem of attracting underrepresented minorities and women into engineering roles, which is where most of our population is. And number one, that just means you've got a very large part of the potential workforce that is not represented sufficiently. So early on, the company started tracking this and looking at this, and was really a role model for the rest of the industry. And in fact, we've started an alliance now that is looking at some of these gender issues with our not only our competitors, but our peer technology companies and our suppliers that are looking at how do we increase gender penetration, how do we increase STEM education, how do we use language that's appropriate and sensitive to both on gender issues and in underrepresented minorities, because the industry is still maturing in some of these areas. And so for us, we have very specific goals. We have what we call our RISE 2030 goals, and this covers everything from climate to water to waste management to power usage, those sorts of things. But a big piece of it is diversity and inclusion. And so one of the things that we're committing to is doubling the number of women that are in senior leadership roles by 2030. We're also going to increase the penetration or the representation of the workforce from 25% women in engineering roles to 40% by 2030. So this is something that is a significant challenge, but we know if we set the goals now and we measure regularly. In fact, we look at, because it's part of annual compensation, a lot of these measures are part of annual compensation for the executives and for the general population. We measure our progress against our 2030 goals and our goals in the interim to get there monthly. And the idea is to make sure people are focused on getting real plans in place, making sure we're going to the right places to recruit so we can increase opportunities. And it's been very successful for us over the years. And we would like to think that we're the leaders in the industry and focusing on these issues.
Excellent. I mean, that's definitely some stretch area elements to that. Patrice, over to yourself. One of the A4S essential guides that we have is focused on social and human capital accounting. The guide gives practical tools and guidance to help finance teams to measure the social and human capital along with the future value chain and the element to help them with decision making. Are there any examples, practical examples or tips that you can share to help others make this progress? I'd love to hear from you on that.
Yeah, great. Thanks again, Devinder. Maybe a couple of things that I could share. We are just in the process of developing our 2020 budget. And in government, sort of the budget is where you allocate your resources, and it's kind of becomes a decision-making structure for us. But what we've done is really focus on aligning that budget process with those 4 priorities that I just talked about, and really working to understand where, as we allocate our resources, where is that going to make the biggest impact, and is it actually going to move the dial on the outcomes related to those 4 areas? So really being able to finding those metrics and measurements, and then we track, what was our investment, what was, the outputs, what were the outcomes, and really using that as the tool to advance those priorities forward. So that's one of the structures that we have. The second one I would talk about is one that we've worked with A4S on as well, which is our social procurement framework. And as a city, we've got a pretty big presence in the supply chain. We have a broad range of procurement, from food services at the concession at the park to building buildings, roads, and bridges. So it's quite a broad spectrum. But we looked at, what can we use our procurement as an opportunity to advance the social goals of the city? And so through this framework, the framework is really focused on increasing the opportunities for what we call underrepresented populations in our supply chain. And we include in that women, 50% of the population, but not half of our businesses, LGBTQ, persons with disabilities, or Indigenous populations. And actually in Canada, the rate of growth of businesses is 9 times for Indigenous businesses than average. So it's certainly an area to focus on. So how do we improve the representation of those groups? And we looked at 2 areas. One is in our approach to diversify our supply chain. So how do we make those opportunities? How do we work with those companies and organizations to make it easier to do business with the city? Sometimes our procurement is set for big corporations, that have a lot of administration. So how do we do that? How do we make it more open, so businesses can participate? And we look at not just in addition to businesses owned by those groups, we also look at social enterprise. And I think, as social enterprise is a business with a social purpose. And what we know is that $1 spent with a social enterprise has a $3 benefit return. And just as an example, we have a catering company locally, and they compete, with everyone else quite equally. But their workforce is focused on people in our downtown core who would have many barriers to traditional employment, and they provide training, they provide jobs. So you can see how a spend with that organization, also you've got a whole group of people who now are participating in the economy and being independent, etc. So focusing on that. And then we also opened up the framework to really all of our vendors that are focusing on diversity and equity, similar to, as George was saying, a big corporation, but doing a lot around advancing diversity. And so we did, our approach was we did a survey actually of all of our vendors to see where they fit in those criteria. And then we looked at all the spend of the corporation, and we identified a number of categories that would be really that we could target for that population, that they'd be more successful in it. And that's where we're kind of focusing our time. What we found through our survey was that about 15% of our vendors did align with our social and diverse criteria within that category of spend. So we set ourselves a goal by 2023 to increase that from 15% to 50%. So we've got a bit of work to do over the next couple of years, but that's sort of the focus of how our supply chain can help advance those social goals. And as far as the role of finance, very much around the data analytics and data analysis, getting that information both from our spend, from our vendors, and then being able to really track and measure all of those metrics as we go through our procurement process over the next few years. So so it's really an exciting project. I think to some extent our finance team initially was, well, this is not going to be competitive and we need to make sure that we're getting the best dollar for the organization. But as we worked through it, just a lot of people really embraced it. The organizations really embraced it and looked for those opportunities. So it's kind of neat. Yeah.
That's excellent. Thank you for sharing that. That's a great return ratio as well. So, George, perhaps, how about your supplier base? How are you working with them around diversity, equity, and inclusion? And what are some tangible actions that Intel is taking?
Great. I'll answer that. I just wanted to follow on one thing that Patrice said that I thought was really well. When you set measures and people may initially look at it and go, what's the return on this? What and 2 things. Number one, when you set goals in any of the dimensions that we've been talking about, people all of a sudden use their creativity and their natural innovation, and they come up with things that create significant value. Our water conservation work and our power utilization is far more efficient than it would have been if we hadn't put these metrics. We find over and over when we challenge ourselves to do better in these areas, which we should do just from what our values are as a company. Yeah. A lot of these things are completely consistent with how we want to operate as a company. But on top of that, you can create significant value when you give yourself audacious goals. Really smart people, which we're all blessed to have, come up with great ideas, and we've found that over and over. And we started this a long time ago, and we've been reporting to the board since 2003 on ESG matters, and we've had significant tie into compensation since 2008. So it's in the system, and we have seen it over and over. So I'm not surprised, Patrice, that you were getting that kind of response. And in the supplier area, we spent about $1 billion in minority firms and gender diversity or women-owned firms, and now we're setting a goal by 2030 to have that be $2 billion. I think we'll more than exceed that, and it's not just U.S. We do it all over the world, and it's super impactful for these firms. Gives them a great chance to get scale, which we bring. If you work with us, you're going to get a lot of scale. And then, of course, with suppliers, you want to make sure that their standards of how they treat their employees, how they source their goods, are the same standards that we have. And so we have a significant engagement with our suppliers on this front, and we know that we're improving the lives of workers all over the world, even if they don't work directly for us. If they work indirectly for us, we want to make sure that their standard of living is acceptable.
That's excellent. That's excellent. Thank you. Just looking at the Canadian landscape for a minute, Patrice, social and human capital doesn't exist in a silo, and I'll be remiss if I didn't mention what Canada is experiencing right now with the terrible floods. And earlier we had the elements of heat. I just want to connect that, the connection between climate change and the impact on people. So how are cities, I guess, and companies for that matter, building more resilience to reduce these kind of impacts? And I'd love your thoughts around that.
Yeah, great, thanks. And yeah, maybe just for context, it's certainly been an extraordinary year, particularly in our part of the country here. From a climate perspective, the flooding, the mudslides, et cetera, from the recent rainfall, it really has devastated a number of communities. And the heat dome of the summer created a number of forest fires, and a whole town was actually destroyed through the fires. And even with that heat, even within the cities, we had several hundred deaths that were specifically attributed to the heat. So absolutely, the connection between the environment and social sustainability is absolutely there. I mean, there's kind of no question. But it's not just those people who are impacted directly by all of these situations, but it's the whole community. So with the floodings, it's the entire communities that are impacted, and also through the floods and the mudslides, the connection to the Port of Vancouver, which is Canada's largest port, was broken through. The highways being blocked, the rails not able to run because of the damage. And so now all of a sudden it's the economy, not just of the local communities, but it is of really all of Canada and even internationally. So that connection, it's not just about climate and infrastructure. It is about the people and how we continue to operate with these kind of events. And I think we're finding, these 1 in 100-year events there are many of them. So it's not like we're experiencing them once every 100 years. It's every year there's some type of an event that seems to be happening. So absolutely, resilience is really key. Your point about how can we be more resilient. And we've got a number of strategies at City, but I think they've evolved over time. Like our first sort of resilient Vancouver strategy, we focus primarily on critical infrastructure, the roads and the bridges, and can people transport, is your water system running, and that is really key. But again, these aren't happening once in 100 years; they're happening more frequently. So we can't think of only about the infrastructure. And the pandemic, showed us that again with so much of our population who couldn't even wasn't able to find food if restaurants are closed, and that was their only way of getting food, things like that. So we really realized that that it's not just about the infrastructure, and our resilient Vancouver strategy actually has a focus area now on homeless and the really vulnerable population, and how do we help that population when we think about these big events, and how to be resilient. We also have a couple of strategies as we're sort of building on this theme that it's not just about the infrastructure. We have a healthy city strategy, and that looks at really all of the elements around a healthy city, as in the social side, the people side. So education, how does that impact health and resilience, right? Poverty, access, just all those factors that impact the ability of our population to be resilient. So it's really about how do you move people along from being vulnerable to being resilient, and moving whole communities. We have a social infrastructure strategy, which is actually quite new, and it's the idea that it's not about just the critical infrastructure. The engineers they know what has to happen around the roads and the bridges, but what about our arts and culture community? What about community centers, places, libraries, places that people go to congregate? Those need to be resilient as well, because in these events you might be able to travel, but your city and your community is about much more than that, and we need to be able to withstand these situations. So it's really kind of a shift in thinking of our traditional resilience, which is sort of structural, and it's really about how do we keep our communities resilient, and be able to go through many of these situations and still be great places to work and support each other as communities, helping the range of those who may have more and those who have less. So it is still an evolution, but it's very encouraging to see that shift in thinking about it much more holistically.
Excellent. Patrice, are there frameworks that are using to help support the joined up decision making, enabling social, environmental, and financial decisions to be incorporated as part of decision making?
Yes, we have been working on that for some time in saying, we're not just, here's the finance team over here doing finance, and the social teams over there doing social, and then we've got our green team doing the climate stuff, and we've worked very hard to try and integrate that. And finance plays a big role in that part, because we kind of can see across all of the organizations, and again that they do come together when it comes time for accessing funding. So one example that I would have is our capital planning process. So we've got about a $3 billion capital plan, and traditionally, each group said, "Here's what I need," and so we've kind of flipped that around and said, "Okay, we're going to look at our areas like the environment, equity, balance those with our financial capacity. So much money we have, here's much that we can use," and really kind of linking that the social and the environmental side, and it's really got people thinking a little bit, just tipping it over, looking at the broader, the integrated piece versus sort of the on the ground. And one of the examples I would have is we were renewing a fire hall. We're in a seismic zone, and so rebuilding this fire hall to meet seismic standards. But at the same time, we built social housing on top of the fire hall. So it's women-led families, low-income women-led families, and that's on top of the fire hall. And then the whole building was built to LEED Gold standards. So touching on the environmental piece. So really looking at it in much more integrated way, whereas previously they'd be all separate decisions and they'd all be separate investments. And so those are the kind of frameworks that help us to integrate that. And I think, really that piece of integrating the climate, which was very, on its own, realizing that climate and the social is so linked now that they aren't really separate. The second one that I might mention again, a financial one is we just issued our first sustainability bond. Last year, we created a sustainability bond framework. We had done green bonds in the past. And a sustainability bond is one that allows you to borrow not just for green, for environmental purposes, but also for social. And so you can do social and/or green projects or integrated projects. And that really sort of resonated for us as far as a lot of what we're trying to do. And it also, again, encouraged the organization to think more broadly that, we can get financing if we can do it across the elements. People just are starting to think differently. So it's another one where just those little, comes from our treasury department, they're all borrowing money, but as word gets out and it gets built into your frameworks, the organization that comes along and starts to think differently as well. So to your point, George, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for that, Patrice. George, Intel also integrates multi-capital disclosures in its 10K financial reporting. How do you get comfortable with the multi-capital disclosures that you are making? And I guess from an internal decision-making perspective, are there other key metrics you are using to support target setting? I know performance tracking and even helping you make your decision-making, but can you see a time where more of this information would be reported externally? It'd be great if you could share some of that.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that A4S spotted early, quite frankly, was the importance of transparency and reporting that people can rely on, so that the influence of the ecosystem for people to constantly improve their ESG capabilities will come out of the comparability between companies, and people will go, wow, I want to be part of a company that has great ESG practices. Now I see either we do or we don't, and it's something that we've taken very seriously for a long time. We publish a 100-page document every May that goes into gory detail on all of our commitments, and members of the financial reporting organization have been joined very closely with our ESG teams to make sure that the information that goes in there is accurate, and that we can stand by anything we put in that document. Obviously now increasingly we're seeing things in our 10Ks and in our proxy that are provide additional detail, but not at the same level. And anything obviously that goes into the K or the proxy, you have everything from SOX processes to all sorts of confirmatory actions to double, triple check everything. I think that's actually where we're headed on reporting for ESG. Mm-hmm. Everybody's working hard to come up with an aligned standard, and we're very supportive of that. And we think that's going to be, when we talk about what's going to have the biggest impact on driving all of these initiatives forward, it's transparency and information that you can rely on when you're making comparisons. And we're all in, and we think that's a great target. And again, it's one of the things when I first learned about A4S, I go, okay, these team members really get it.
Excellent. No, that's good. Transparency is the key, and yeah, everybody gets that. We're getting into the concluding element of our webinar here. To both of you, as the world is moving from commitment to action, what single action or various actions do you think will deliver the biggest impact over the next 12 months? And please take a second or two to think about it, but love to hear your thoughts on the action that we need to take. Who wants to start?
George, you want to go?
Sure, happy to. I think more of the same, but with more intentionality around the finance teams putting in the infrastructure in place that will allow us to tackle these issues, which in many cases are quite challenging and are in some cases very controversial, depending on whatever your approach is. But to do it in a thoughtful, measurable, repeatable way that just gets the information out in a way that people can rely on. We're spending a lot of time over the next year getting that in place and making sure, for instance, that we have the same sort of discipline support for this as we do for any other reported item on our financial statements. And the other thing is, as we said earlier, the next 12 months, there's a lot we don't know about. And so staying nimble and doubting that you know it all is probably healthy.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, 12 months is not very long, but on the other hand, it's a lot of time to do some things, right? And what jumps out to me really is just around climate, and I guess just sort of what we've been experiencing of late is with COP26 being it's over, but it's just the start, and making sure that we just start doubling down on all of our actions around climate. And at the city, we're looking to do our part, but it's it is sort of global. If I get a little more central or local, really our team supporting the work that's happening around equity in the city, equity and homelessness, mental health and addiction. There's really and for you live in big cities, there's a real challenge around that. And so our team's really supporting the work, and but a number of frameworks that the city's put together, and a lot of actions around housing, homelessness, equity, and our team's really helping to support that and figuring out the ways that you can measure those impacts and report them back to. And to your point, George, we have a real responsibility to the public to articulate how we're spending public funds, and we're trying to sort of shift that to, and how's that changing the outcome, as opposed to, well, governments always say, we're putting $10 million here and $20 billion here. And what does that mean? It's just a number, right? And so so what?
Yeah.
What's that going to do? So how do we translate those into metrics? And I think that gets more and more important, because we are going to be asking in all levels of government, I think, for more funding from people, just the situation that governments are in, and how do you explain what that's going to achieve? I think that's the hardest part, but the part that is interesting for us to sort of get beyond sort of accounting for it, to actually showing how it adds value, how those investments add value. So I think that's going to be more important to keep the public trust as we go through all of these changes, because I think it's very easy to lose that along the way.
Yeah.
Excellent. Recognizing social and human capital is important for a company's long-term sustained value creation is the key, and finance has a key role to play. And you've heard that from the leaders here. Thank you, Patrice. Thank you, George, and also to Harmeet for sharing your insights and your leadership in this space. It's a huge, I guess, element to climb, or a mountain to climb, but you guys are definitely there, and thank you for that. I also want to thank the audience for joining us today. And please remain tuned in as I'm handing it back to Jessica now, who's going to be joined by Professor Emily Schuckberg from Cambridge University and Ruth Peratt who's the CFO of Google and Alphabet. And they're going to talk about technology. So thank you, everyone. And with that, I'll be signing off.
Right. Thank you, Devinder. Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Thank you.